stories don't define you. How you tell them will.
Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker at Elkins Consulting. In my work with coaching clients, I guide people to improve their communication using storytelling as the foundation of our work together. What I've realized over years of coaching and podcasting is that the majority of people don't realize the impact of the stories they share on their internal messages and on the people they're sharing them with. My work with leaders and people who aspire to be leaders follows a similar path to the interviews on my podcast, uncovering pivotal moments in their lives and learning how to share them to connect more authentically with others, to make their presentations and speaking more engaging, to reveal patterns that have kept them stuck or moved them forward, and to improve their relationships at work and at home. When you're ready to get started collecting your own stories, my book, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, is available in all the regular places, and the audiobook version is now available on Google Play and on my website, elkinsconsulting.com. As a special bonus for listeners, the audiobook includes 2 songs recorded by my band, Spare Change, in my living room in Montana. Keep an eye out for announcements through LinkedIn and via my Elkins Consulting Facebook and Instagram pages, or visit my website, elkinsconsulting.com, to learn more. Also on my website is a free podcast interview checklist. It's available to download to make sure you make the most of your next podcast interview. Today, the guest that I am honored to have on Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will podcast is my friend Kristen Sherry. And we met through LinkedIn and have a lot of mutual connections, which is why we decided that we should connect directly. And I think what really got us connected was when I responded to your message asking about audiobooks and how you recorded or how you were going to record them. So we'll have to get into that conversation later on. But welcome to the show, Kristen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really an honor to be on your show with you. So many people in my network speak so highly of you, and I see why after we've had an opportunity to spend time together.
Thank you. Thank you. So I did send you a message to give you a little heads up that I always ask guests to share a little something about themselves that most people don't know. So it wouldn't be on your bio, it wouldn't be in your LinkedIn profile. It's not something you talk about regularly. So do you have something for me?
Yeah, I am terrified of spiders, and to the point where it's irrational. Like when I see a spider on the wall, I do a standoff for like 20 minutes with the spider, like wanting to suck it up with the vacuum, but I'm afraid to get close to it because I'm afraid the vacuum is going to suck the spider at me and then it's going to fly on me. And my husband will come and he'll take the vacuum out of my hand and he'll just walk and suck it up. But I get paralyzed with fear over spiders. And if I find one on me, like I'll start screaming and dancing hysterically and freaking. And I'm normally a very calm person, but spiders make me completely irrational.
Wow. That actually kind of surprises me a little bit just because I know you. And I'm not surprised about a fear of spiders because many of us have the fear of spiders, but to become so irrational about it, that is a little surprising. And you don't think
I get my heart pounds. I go into fight or flight mode. It's really, I have no idea why, because I'm not like that. I'm not a fearful person in general, but something about spiders is just really irrational.
You know, I read something years ago that said that we can pass on irrational fears to our infants, our babies in utero. Did you know that?
Oh, no, I've never heard that.
There was a study done where they had pregnant mice get exposed to tarantula, which of course the tarantulas eat small critters. And they would be in a glass terrarium with glass between them, and the tarantula would leap at the mouse. And even though the mouse didn't get eaten, it would, respond fearfully and run away or whatever. And then the baby mice would be exposed to the tarantula and all they had to do was see the tarantula and run away.
Oh, interesting. I have like goosebumps and I'm visualizing a tarantula bouncing at plexiglass at me from what you just said. And now like my arms are all
tingly
the hairs are standing on end just about it.
Well, I won't even begin to tell you the stories about my old house. Our home is in Helena, Montana, which is very well known. That the valley part is very well known for its black widow scourge. But where I live up on the side of the mountain, it's not as prevalent. But I know there are some in the basement, so I won't go into
I'm
details
not
about
coming to
that.
sleep over.
We'll just avoid the basement, and everything will be fine.
I used to
Yeah.
have dreams. I used to be afraid as a child that spiders would crawl into my mouth when I was asleep. Yeah, I don't know what is my deal with spiders.
I would be willing to bet that if somebody hypnotized you and got you back to that early childhood, there would be some trauma related to a spider
Probably.
that just freaked you out. And I wonder if that would resolve some of it. I don't have nearly the fear of spiders that I used to. Like I used to be like you. I would freak out. As a matter of fact, I was bitten by a seriously poisonous spider in Australia one time and had to go to the hospital. And but and the spiders in Australia are really, they're humongous. Like they're bigger than tarantulas.
They're
The
probably
huntsman,
on leashes and people take them for
seriously. Well, the huntsman, we won't talk much more about spiders because then we'll both have nightmares.
yeah.
But for some reason, I think living here and then being a parent to two boys and not wanting to demonstrate fear in front of them, for some reason, I've kind of gotten to this point where small ones I'll actually catch in a glass and put outside. The big ones I'll squish because, but smaller ones,
Okay, we have to not. I'm starting to get the
okay. Let's talk about something else. I'm really good at changing direction because I have adaptability in my top strengths.
There you go.
So we're going to jump right back into the conversation we were having before I hit record, that I was so bummed that I stopped. Like I was realizing that we needed to record it. So we were talking about the fact that we are baseline happy people. And we were talking about the book by, what did you say his name
Sean
was?
Achor.
Sean Achor, that my brother gave me. And that whole idea of happiness versus contentedness, and happiness and positivity in StrengthsFinder versus being optimistic in the Big Five. So can you explain a little bit about what you meant by that? You said neither of us have positivity in our top strengths, so we don't lean that direction to solve problems, but our personality is optimistic. So can you explain that a little?
Yeah, so we have different layers of who we are. If you think about an iceberg, like a human iceberg, we have layers, just like the Shrek movie when he says ogres are like onions, they have layers. People are like that too. So all you can really observe about a person is what's above the surface, the 10% of the iceberg, but you've got that 90% below. And all of these different elements make up who a person is and how they behave. So you have their past experiences, you have their critical thinking skills, you have their emotional intelligence, their values, their personality, and then their talent or their strengths. And as you go deeper down in the quote unquote ocean, those things become more immutable in us, right? So we're born with our talents, so those don't really change much over time. They might shift around and leapfrog each other, but our weaknesses don't become strengths. Our personality can be affected a little bit by our experiences, maturity, emotional intelligence, and things like that. Which is why personality tests, sometimes people won't agree with those results because it doesn't take into account maturity and experience. So when people will see their CliftonStrengths results and they'll say, oh, I'm really surprised that positivity isn't in my top 5 because everyone's always saying I'm such a positive person.
I hear
well, there's
that a lot.
difference. Yeah, there's a difference between your personality, which is your natural temperament, and your strengths. So people who have positivity as a talent tend to use it very outwardly, intentionally. So they work to come alongside someone to encourage them. They're known as encouragers. Whereas people who have positive personalities might just walk around bubbly and projecting positivity, but they might not be intentionally working to encourage people in a one-on-one relationship context. So I have a natural positive temperament in the Big Five that looks at the 5 factors of personality. So I have what's known as a low skepticism score. People who are high on that dimension are very skeptical people, and it's more about your outlook on life. So when I am high in optimism in my personality, it means I have an optimistic outlook, which is different than being an encourager.
Right,
Does
of
that make
course.
sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think of it as people with positivity in their top strengths. That's how they approach things,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to I'm an optimist is how I think about things.
Exactly.
I don't approach a project or a problem by thinking, oh, I need to encourage this person. I don't use that as a tool to solve a problem.
Exactly. You get it. So that tool, as you said, it's the way they build connections with people. They build connection through positivity versus a way of viewing the world.
Yeah. So the reason we first started talking was because I was interested in the YouMap. Well, beyond the book question about recording an audiobook, which we can talk about at the end so we can promote it a little bit, because I'm excited about it. But it's the YouMap that got me interested in, and some of what we talked about in that first conversation that was just so enlightening was this whole idea of you were looking for a much more complex way of looking at your coaching clients than to separate them. And you said something about having your coaching clients taking like 5 different assessments so that you
Yeah.
could, and that's why you created the YouMap. So tell us a little bit about your background so that people understand why we're having this conversation.
Sure. So first of all, it starts with my childhood. I was raised by a coach. My mother is a coach, and so I wasn't raised in a traditional way. So my mother would ask me questions like, how does it make you feel to be right? Why do you have that need? Like I'd have all these like weird questions.
Like, I'm 4, Mom. I don't know.
So yeah, I was coached instead of reared, if you will, which is an interesting
Disciplined.
yeah. And so coaching was always very natural to me because that became sort of my response to people as well. I coached people. So when people say, when did you become a coach? It was a really blurry line
I
since
was 4.
yeah, I've always done it. I coached people when I was in high school. I coached my boyfriend when he was talking about what he wanted to do with his life, and he was going to go for air conditioning and refrigeration, and now he's a chiropractor that owns his own practice in Florida.
Wow.
Yeah, because I had these conversations with him about pursuing a different path. But anyway, so I've always done that. But originally, I was going to school to be a neurologist. So I went for neuroscience, and then I decided I didn't want to do that. So I sort of just wandered around in my career. Honestly, Sarah, it was this weird sort of state government, web development, business intelligence, operations management, leadership, coaching, learning and development. I was all over the place. I think the only thing I haven't worked in is finance. So, but I realized that windy path I took was a couple of reasons behind that. So first of all, at that time, I had learner in my top 5 strengths. So people who have learner tend to get wanderlust after a couple years in a job. They get bored if they're not learning things and growing. So they tend to job hop, and they feel bad about it because why can't I be happy in a job? Why can't I just stay there and be happy? But you'll never get between a person and their strengths because it sets your priorities. So my priority was learning things all the time. So I never wanted to stay anywhere. And when people would block me from going up, I would just go sideways. Oh, well, I'll go see what it's like to work in business intelligence. So I'll go in operations now. I was just looking for learning experiences, but all of that prepared me to understand the world of work and understand people. And so I did a lot of workshops and coaching, and I got certified in executive coaching and career coaching in 2007, but I've been using the CliftonStrengths Finder back when it was called StrengthsFinder since 2004. And so I was always fascinated by what made people tick. And so I started taking all these different certifications, and really what drove me was human potential. And I started to notice that I would meet people that were really bright or had these amazing talents that they weren't using. So they were in roles that just didn't fit the brilliance that they had. And I became curious about that. And so I would talk to a lot of people, and I started coaching people in my companies. And before you knew it, I would get people standing at my door and they would say, can I talk to you for a minute? And I always knew what it was going to be about, their career. So I started career coaching before I was even a career coach, which is really interesting, which I don't coach anymore now. I've retired from coaching, and now I coach coaches instead. I train coaches. I don't coach coaches. Well, I guess I do coach them. But anyway, all that to say, I became fascinated with two main things. Number one, people really didn't know themselves. And I always say it's hard to read the label when you're inside the jar. People, when I would tell them things, when I would tell them these wonderful things about them, they would have a couple of reactions. Different people have different reactions. Number one, they would just completely be surprised or stunned, like, no, like as if it was the first time they had ever heard that feedback. Number two, they would say, oh, I've always heard that's a weakness. And they would sort of just chalk what I said was good about them as being bad. Or number three, they were uncomfortable owning that about themselves. And there was this confidence or self-esteem issue that didn't allow them to embrace what I had told them. So I started to get very, very confused of what was going on with people. And so I realized people in general tended to lack self-awareness. The second thing I noticed was people had a ton of baggage from their childhood, whether it was their teachers telling them they were mischievous because they were curious, or they were creatives and would doodle on their desk and they would get in trouble. But whatever they were compelled to do, they would get in trouble from their parents, grandparents, whoever their caregivers were, teachers. And so they started to have self-esteem issues around who they were, because most of the time we're trying to do the best by kids. And we're trying to prevent them from becoming losers in their relationships, in their careers. So we point out the bad things about them in order to try to remediate those things. But what we end up doing is handing them a bag of low self-esteem that they carry around and cling tightly to their whole lives. And so I was really on a mission to help people realize that they are a unique masterpiece and they can maximize their potential if they embrace that and really lean into it. Long answer.
It was a good answer. And it brought two things into my head. One is that I think there's a fourth thing that happens with people who don't understand their strengths or are actively dismissive of their strengths. Some of them seem to know their strengths, but they have this modesty or this sense of being humble that they can't talk about them. Like they want to, it's not that they're dismissing them, they know what they're good at, but they feel like if they talk about them, then it's dismissive of other people and their contribution. And so that is another thing that I've noticed in recent years working with executives, is that they don't want to take credit for it.
No, you're exactly right. I had a woman come into my office one time and she said to me, I worked with her, we were in different departments. She said, I've been applying for jobs in the organization and I keep getting rejections. And she said, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And so we started to talk about what she was looking to do next and all of this stuff. And I said, are you open to some feedback? And she said, yes. And I said, you don't present confidently when you talk about what you do in your experience. And she said, well, that it's difficult for me to talk about myself. I feel like I'm bragging. And I said to her,
I've heard that too.
Yeah. I said, when I give you advice, do I seem confident to you in how I present the coaching, the questions that I ask, the guidance that I provide? Do I seem confident? And she said, oh yeah, you're very confident. And I said, do you view that as a negative thing? Do you trust me because I feel like I come across like I know what I'm talking about? And she said, oh, definitely. And I said, okay, so if you go into a hiring manager's office and you seem tentative about yourself, how are you giving them confidence that they can trust you with the important work they need you to do in this role? And the light bulb went off in her mind. So I told her, it's not about bragging. I said, it's your job to instill confidence in that hiring manager that you know what you're doing. And if you come across tentative, insecure, that humility could be interpreted as a lack of confidence in your ability. And she had never considered that.
Yeah, that's a great story. And that's actually some of the guidance that I've given in recent years with executives, and particularly helping them understand how to tell a story so it doesn't feel like bragging. Because you're starting with, what was the project or the obstacle or the issue that you were handling? Who else was on the team? How did you guide them to get things done? Or were you part of the team, and what was your role in it? And you're telling the story. What was an obstacle that you faced part way? How did you get through it? That's not bragging, it's observing. It's telling a story about what happened. So
it's just objective. Absolutely.
Exactly.
There's a huge gap between objectively sharing the truth of an accomplishment and saying, and wouldn't you know, I was the smartest person on that team.
Exactly.
And everyone would tell me every day they wish they could be like me. I mean, there's a big divide between those two things.
Yeah. I tell people, if you have to tell people you're smart, you're not doing it right. That's hilarious.
Yeah, that's something people can pick up on their own.
Yeah, really quickly. So the other thing that popped into my head as you were answering that first question was about our children and what we do to them when we point out the things that are wrong with them. While there are behavioral issues that we have to acknowledge,
of course,
there are ways to present it in that will help them understand the why behind it, and not about what led to that behavior. What is their personality that led to that behavior? So one of the best resources, the only resource that I really used other than my mother and some other great moms that I knew, was a book called The Blessing of a Skinned Knee. And I think it's the perfect complement to this conversation, because a big part of the book is about the fact that many of those behaviors that you find really irritating and difficult to address are the ones that are going to make your kid a successful adult.
Absolutely.
So we know that. That's not the first time you've heard that. And it's not the first time you've been thinking about that. When they are intense and know what they want, and they're being stubborn, or they won't accept no for an answer, those are things that will make them resilient adults. But the book really talks about the fact that each of us has the capacity for good and evil. That no one is all good, no one is all evil. So we all have the capacity, and that it's our choice every day, every moment that we make a choice and interaction with somebody, whether we're going to lean into the good part or the bad part. And the book really presented a lot of opportunities to use discipline to uncover their strengths, rather than tell them they're terrible people, and it's so tempting. You're just a slob when you walk into your 16-year-old's room. It's so tempting. But I love the way that you put that if we give them that baggage, they're going to carry it around for a long time.
That's right. That's the reason why I wrote my children's book series, to help kids uncover their strengths, their values, their skills, and their personality. Because I was really writing for the parents as well, so they would see the gift in their talents instead of the shadow side of their talent. And I do that a lot with my daughter. I have 4 kids, but my daughter's 7. And I'll say things like, oh, I wish you would have made a different choice here. And tell me why you made that choice. And I will talk to her about connecting the consequences that she doesn't like, because she'll think I'm just being mean, or my husband's being mean if she gets some punishment. So I always try to connect it back to the choices that she's making. Because when I was a child, my mother told me people's lives are largely a product of the decisions that they make. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And as I got older, I started to look at decisions I had made, and in particular areas of my life that didn't turn out how I had wanted them. And I would connect it back to the different decision points that I had made. And that was a really good lesson for me, because it took me down a path of taking personal accountability, not to the point where I experienced shame or anything like that,
right. But owning
but
it.
that lesson taught me personal accountability of what decisions did I make that led to this outcome. Now, even if we have something that happens to us that wasn't a personal decision, like we are genetically predisposed to cancer or something like that, we have choices in navigating that journey though, right? So we have
Right.
choices throughout life, even if things happen to us that weren't a product of our decisions.
Right. Like if you know that you hold the genetic predisposition to some form of colon cancer and you continue to choose to eat meat with nitrates in it and all the things that we know contribute to people who are already susceptible, those are choices you make. I'm going to repeat it back to you to make sure I got it right. People's lives are largely based on the decisions they make.
That's close enough. I said people's lives are largely a product of the
That's
decisions
better.
they make.
Are largely a product.
And some people really recoil when I share that with them, because some people are very outwardly focused. They're looking to blame other people for their circumstances. And I'll say, okay, well, be that as it may, whatever is going on out here, this is the perception that people have of you. What do you want to do about that? So if you're having to give tough feedback to a leader about things their team has said about them, well, I'm only this way because this is how my boss expects me to be, or they don't really know me. They've only been on the team for 2 months, or, they have all these excuses.
Right.
This is the culture here. If I don't do this, blah, blah, blah. People have
but
all these
how did you contribute? Because I can understand why people might resist that sentence, especially people who are people who've largely been disconnected, minorities, people of color that have been disconnected from a very early age and haven't had the opportunities that many of us have had. At the same time, one of the comments that I've had to make with a coaching client was when there were 2 episodes with this particular coaching client, and one was he was telling me about the reason his behavior was what it was, and it was all about how as a child his mom did this, his mom did that, and I said, "How old are you?" He said, "What does that have to do with it?" I said, "No, I'm serious. Do you mind? How old are you?" And he said, 40. I said, "When do you take responsibility for your choices?" Because for the last 20 plus years, your choices are what led you to where you are right now. And granted, you had a hard time making good choices because you didn't have good modeling. But today, the choice is yours. And then the other aspect of that was the same person was complaining about how people perceived him and then said, "Well, I don't really care because that's just the way I am." And
oh boy.
Yeah. And we had this whole conversation around, are you satisfied with your relationships? He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Are you married?" He said, "No." I said, "Have you been in love? Have you been in a relationship?" "Yes." "And what happened?" And he said, "Well, we broke up." And I said, "Okay, why?" And he said, "You're not my what did he say? You're not my counselor," or something like that. "You're not my therapist." I said, "Okay, well, let's back up a little bit. What about your relationships at work? Are you satisfied with those relationships? Do you feel like they are as good as they could be? Or would you like them to be different? Would you like them to be better?" He said, "Well, yeah." And I said, "Then you have to take some of the responsibility for how people perceive you."
One of the things people don't realize when they say this is just who I am, there's a difference between your personality and your behavior. So you might have a personality that likes to be in control, but that doesn't mean that you can't ask questions and listen in your behavior. So your behavior is where you have that space of choice. Your natural temperament wants to do one thing, but there's a space where you can pause and say, I'm going to choose to behave a different way. And I think that's such a cop out when people say, well, this is just how I am. I am a very autonomous person who likes to be in charge. But if I just try to boss my husband around, I'm going to get divorced.
Right.
And so my mother asked me the best question when I was in my early 20s. She said, Kristen, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective?
Oh, yeah. Yep, I've had that conversation before too, or it was directed at me more than once. Yeah, I think that's part of why StrengthsFinder was something that I was compelled by. Why it was the one assessment that actually piqued my interest, because I've seen and done quite a lot. And one of the things that was frustrating to me is that you'd get the results, maybe you'd do a workshop at work if it was a work related thing, and then it would be over. And you'd never really dig into how you could apply what you learned about yourself. Okay, what do I do with this? And with strengths, finding out that I had command in my top strengths and activator really put things in perspective for me for why I was being perceived the way I was being perceived. And it allowed me to take that step back and look at my other strengths to say, oh, well, you also have adaptability. So you can switch gears easily. And maybe Lisa Cummings is a phenomenal strengths coach that I interviewed on my podcast. She said, imagine you have an amplifier in front of you and the knobs have your top 5 or 6 strengths on them. And you can turn them up and down depending on the situation. You'd never turn them off because they're your natural talents. You can't turn them off. But if my command is being perceived badly, I can turn that down a little and turn up my strategic and think, how do I get myself out of this?
That's right. I always use a coffee mug analogy that so you have all these mugs, these are your top strengths in the cupboard. And if I'm going to drive my daughter to school, I'm going to take the tall, slender travel mug. Maybe if I'm going to sit on the couch, I might want the one that has the nice big bowl that I can hold on. But I'm not going to take the mug with the really big bowl and just sit it on top of the cup holder that it won't fit in. Because as soon as I turn the corner, the hot tea is going to spill out all over my lap. So that's not the right mug for that situation. So what is the strength that I can pull from? Am I going into a situation where I need to be collaborative? Maybe I need to pull that relating strength. Or am I going into
harmony?
Am I going into a situation with a bunch of cautious, like thinking types? Maybe I don't want to go in there with that influencing strength or lead with that. And I do the same thing with my personality. In DISC, I'm a DI. And I always lead with my I, even though I want to lead with my D. And I seek to collaborate, encourage, and do all of those things. And the minute people are not getting results, then my D will shift to take over and start leading. But I always on purpose lead with my I, even if I don't feel like it, if I feel like leading with my D.
Say the words DISC. Can you say what the words are for that? For our listeners? I know what they are, but I think our listeners would need to hear it.
So they're, according to Jungian theory, there are 4 basic temperaments that people have. I sort of subscribe more to the big 5 now, but on its face, you have people who are dominance driven. They fear loss of control. They like to get results. They like to take action, and they challenge themselves and others. Influencing people, what they prioritize is getting results as well. So that's where or taking action rather. So that's where you'll have the partnership with the dominance driven person. So they like to take action, but they also like to collaborate and have enthusiasm for their work. So that's what they prioritize from a personality, needs, and motivations perspective. Steady people or supportive people, they're relationship oriented too, like the influencers. They prioritize collaboration like the influencers, but they also prioritize being supportive and having stability. So they don't tend to like a lot of change.
I have all the strengths words popping into my head for each of these, but go ahead.
Yeah. And then you have the cautious or the conscientious type. And, they have animals and colors. They're all DISC. They're all 4-factor model of personality, whether it's owl or golden retriever or otter or whatever. But the conscientious person, they share challenge in common. They will challenge themselves and others. With the Ds, the dominance driven people, they share liking stability with the S's, but in addition to that, they also like accuracy. So you can't come with your ideas on a napkin, a stained napkin. You have to have done your
Right.
research.
This is somebody
So
that was, yeah, you think of an accountant as the C person.
yeah, exactly. My husband went to school for accounting and he's a C. And remember, I'm an I, I'm also a D, and he's a C, and we get along swimmingly.
Mhm.
It's not personality that creates as much conflict as people think. And I say that, and people just sort of sit back in their chair and they're like, we've always heard about personality conflicts. It's the strengths. People have far more conflict around strengths than they do personality, because our strengths set our priorities. So if my priority is to get into that meeting and be relational, or to be flexible or go with the flow, and your priority is to take action right now, you must have like a lot of conflict, inner conflict with some of your strengths. But think about a futuristic thinker
Mhm.
married to a person who has adaptability, who lives in the moment.
Mhm.
I actually coached a couple, an NFL football player and his wife, who had this situation. And he would always say, oh, I want to talk about the vision for our family and what we're going to do when I retire from the NFL. And they would have these conversations. And that's why he hired me, because he was retiring from the NFL and he wanted to know what to do next. And I started to go through this with him. We did YouMap, and he said, I want you to do this with my wife. Well, his wife stayed at home, but he wanted her to think about what she would do after the kids were gone, because he's a futuristic thinker.
Right.
And it was really
It's like,
interesting
I'll deal
because,
with it when I get there.
right, she has adaptability. So
Mhm.
when he would talk about visions for the future, she would say to him, whatever you want to do, babe, I'll support you. Well, on pillar 4 of YouMap, the personality piece, she's known as the attendant, the doer, and the helper. So she helps people through service, right? By doing things for people. So her words even said that, whatever you want to do, I'll support you. Well, he interpreted that as disinterest in talking about their future. He started to feel resentment that it was all on him to figure out their plans. And when he saw her YouMap and read the definition of adaptability, he called me and he said, a
Oh,
light bulb went off. It's not that she's not interested or she's putting it all on me. She doesn't know how to do that
right.
because she lives
It's
in
not
the
how
now.
she
So her
thinks.
brain doesn't work like that. He said, that never occurred to me because it's so easy for me to envision down the road. I didn't realize other people couldn't do that too.
Right. Well, and on top of that, if you think about what was causing the tension, it wasn't just that she doesn't know how to do it. She doesn't have any interest in doing it.
Yeah.
And there's so many compliments there, compliment with an E, between them, but they were so busy, or he was kind of busy looking at what she was missing, that he wasn't
Mhm.
thinking about what she brought to the table already, which is
Yeah. And we
her
talked through
ability to
that.
shift gears, right?
Yes. And guess what? Every couple of years, they were having to move to a new city. He would get traded to the
Uh-huh.
Falcons, and he'd get traded to the Buffalo Bills, and then he'd get traded to the Tampa Bay Bucks. And before you knew it, she was just like, no worries, I'll get everything packed. And she was responsible for packing everything up because she would flex. And he never
Yeah.
connected that. Think about, I
Mhm.
said to him, think about if you were married to somebody who wasn't adaptable and fussed at you every single time. You're uprooting me again from my friends. I finally just make friends.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And
So that was the real value.
the
Mhm.
expectation that she would somehow have a career or have an idea of what she wants to do with her future when she hasn't stayed in one place for more than 2 or 3 years
Yeah.
at a time. Like, that whole expectation is kind of absurd, I would
Yeah.
think.
Well,
That's
so all of
fascinating.
the resentment immediately melted away. And it's interesting because I'll
Oh, I
have some of
love
the YouMap
that.
coaches call me and say, I understand my son now for the first time. And I wish that we
Mhm.
hadn't had all the conflict we've had, because that's what happens with parents and children. It's sort of like, I think God has a sense of humor in that he puts people who are opposites together and then
Yes.
puts the things that drive you crazy about your spouse into your child. It's just really kind of
Oh
funny to
my
talk to
gosh, I'm
people
living
about.
that. I
Yeah.
totally hear you.
Yeah, it happens all the time. And it happens with such a high degree of frequency. I have to think it's a fun little like joke.
Well, I have to say, my mom early on, she doesn't remember saying this, but when I was 18 and going through a really hard time with a boss and work, she said, it's a trial. This is a trial. If you don't figure this out, or if you don't deal with it, you just run away. Because I could have just quit, walked away from it. So if you do that, it's just going to keep coming back to you over and over again. So in that context, and it did, I was 40 before I figured that pattern out, which was so disappointing. But you think of that in the context of families, we are placed in places where we have these challenges, where we can grow, where we can choose our relationships and choose how to address those differences among us.
When I used to have struggles with people in my life, in the workplace, when I was young, my mother would, because I started working as a teenager as well, my mother would say to me, if you just get up and quit, Jane is going to be at your next workplace, but her name will be Paul.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Our mothers have to meet someday.
Yeah, those same people are everywhere that you have trouble getting along with.
They are. And I'm just, full circle, we come right back to this whole understanding ourselves. And there are two parts I'd like to bring back before we wrap this up. And one is, when we know ourselves, we start to understand better where our patterns are. And it's not just uncovering the pattern itself, who Jane is that keeps coming back as Paul, and then Jennifer, and then Karen, and then Ruth, or whatever. They're going to keep coming back, but until you understand your role in it, and you're self-reflective enough to understand the choices that you're making that are contributing to that friction or that conflict, you're just going to keep doing it. And I see that in families. I think that's part of what breaks them up.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember before I started to embrace self-awareness, I remember I used to work at the University of Buffalo, and there was a woman on my team, and she was a steady, cautious in DISC, the works at a slower pace, like stability, and I'm just like a bulldozer. So I would come into the workplace on Monday morning, and I would stand in her doorway, and we liked each other. We liked each other, but I would just start like machine gun at her about whatever. And I thought, boy, isn't she an odd duck? She always has this red blotchy all over her neck. I had no clue that I was the one causing her to get these red blotches all over her chest.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That is, I love that. And of course, naturally, it brought back a memory for me of coaching clients that I was working with, a supervisor and her employee, where the employee would come to the supervisor that was just like, the employee was like you, the supervisor was like this woman that you were just describing. And the person like you would walk away feeling totally dismissed. Like she didn't care. She wasn't interested. She doesn't like me, because the person, the supervisor would like take a step back, cross her arms in front of her chest, maybe get blotchy. I didn't ask about that, but it's possible. But it was this overwhelm, like, I cannot handle your energy right now. That is not something that I deal with well, is that level of energy and excitement and enthusiasm, because I need to slow down and see what the next step is. So I love that story. It was me. I was causing her blotchiness. That's hilarious.
And I didn't realize that in the moment. I realized that years later in hindsight. It's not like she gave me that feedback.
No, of course not. And that's the thing, is that I think we rarely know at the moment what is going on. We have to look in hindsight, but the benefit of that isn't living in the past. It's seeing how we contributed and knowing what we can do in the future to make sure our relationships are healthier and safer.
That, you just hit the nail on the head, Sarah, because I think that's what people do, is they assume that other person was just a mess. I'm going to divorce them or quit from them and go somewhere else. But like, wherever you go, there you are. You're taking yourself with you. And so when I got divorced, so I'm remarried to my forever husband now, but when I got divorced, I went to therapy, even though I knew my first husband had a lot of issues and red flags that I ignored, and my parents warned me not to marry him, and I did anyway. And on my wedding day, I said to my dad, I feel like I'm making the biggest mistake of my life. It's sort of funny to think about in hindsight. We're
Yeah.
friends now. It's all fine. But
Yeah.
and he doesn't listen to any of the podcasts I'm on. But when I think about that, I went to a therapist because I said to the therapist, I don't want to take any of my issues from that marriage or any of my behaviors that contributed to that into my next marriage, because I will never have an unhappy marriage ever again. I will not do that because it's a terrible way to live. And my husband is as committed. And I remember one time I was getting worked up at my husband about something. He had said something I had told him, and I was like, I never said that. And he said, you know what? I could be misremembering. He said, I don't care that much about being right. And it pulled me immediately out. And to my mother saying, you care more about being right or being effective. And it was an immediate reboot. But I remember the therapist fired me after 3 weeks or 3 months. I can't remember. He said, you don't need a therapist. I'm firing.
But you think about how many people don't consider their role in it. And it just makes me so sad. Even abusive relationships, now there is no excuse. And
Right.
I will go walk right into fire for somebody who's been abused in a relationship. I still know that we have patterns. And anyone who has been abused, they know that they have patterns of finding abusers in their lives.
Yes.
Because they don't know. And if just one of those people listens to this and says, oh, maybe I am playing a role. And it's not that you deserve it. There is absolutely nothing about that. But what is it that you're doing that is, first of all, allowing that behavior to happen? What is it that you are thinking about yourself and your stories that are attracting you to people that are like this?
That's the key word, is we attract. So I will tell people a lot of times, like, I don't have people will write about toxic people and how do you get toxic people out of your life. And I'm like, I don't have toxic people in my life because I don't attract toxic people.
Well, and maybe you do, but you recognize it. Well,
you can't, you can't choose who you're related to, right?
Right.
But
you choose the time you spend with them.
Exactly. So I remember being on a team one time, and a lot of the people on the team were being mistreated, and everybody was like, oh, you're her favorite because she doesn't mistreat you. I remember someone said that to me, and I was like, no, I don't tolerate misbehavior. So when we're in one-on-ones and it starts to creep up, I respectfully say, you know what, it's not going to work for me to be micromanaged, or whatever the behavior is. I address disrespect when it happens to me. I will say things to people like, and I'm never rude, because it doesn't work to say, you were rude to me and I'm not going to tolerate that. You're immediately setting someone else up to be defensive. So that doesn't work.
Exactly.
But I will say, you know, I've been thinking about that comment in the meeting, and that I'm just not comfortable with our relationship working that way. So let's talk about how we can have a healthier relationship moving forward, because I don't think we're going to be able to work effectively with those types of interactions in our relationship. So I might say it like that, but I don't, and people will say, well, you know, I don't think well in the moment. And just to say something, it doesn't matter. You can always revisit and say, you know, I've been thinking about what happened. It's never too late to reopen that door and say, you know, I've been thinking about something, and then bring it up.
Well, it's always so much easier to walk away. I should have said, I should have done. And I think there's a lot of fear around conflict and having to address it. And sometimes you think it'll just blow over. And I've written about a situation I had with a toxic person in my office in my final job before I became exclusively self-employed. Yay. She was a really bitter person, and she is toxic. And there wasn't anything I could do about our relationship because nothing I did was going to change it.
Yeah.
But there was a time where I finally decided not to tolerate it. She was yelling at me, and literally yelling at me. And I addressed the behavior. I mean, I could have said, wow, you're a horrible person, because she is.
Right.
That would have been the truth. But, and you know me, that is so rare to hear come out of my mouth. But this
There
is
are
a
people
really,
that choose horrible behavior, and
yeah,
that's
she's
their
bitter and
modus
angry.
operandi. Yeah.
Exactly. And very generous to people that she cares about, but man. But anyway, what I did was I called her on her behavior. I said, I understand you feel insulted because I went around you. This is why I did it. Because you're not nice to me. You're dismissive. You talk behind my back. If I have a choice of who to go to ask a question, I'm going to go to anybody but you. So if you're going to continue to behave this way, I'm going to continue to go to anyone but you to ask a question. And that works. And granted, I wasn't going to be fired from her. She wasn't going to fire me. But the reality is, if you don't address it, even with a boss, if you don't say, wow, I've been thinking about it, and that was really insulting.
Yeah.
That's not okay.
I don't think it matters if it's your boss. I realize that people need money to pay their bills. But I always believe that things are going to work out in my favor because of that optimistic worldview that we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
I was in a job that was absolute crazy town. It was absolute crazy town. And they had all these wonderful perks. Like, they had these double wide fridges full of every type of beverage you can imagine. Lunch was free. They passed around menus every day.
They had to do something because they treated their people so badly.
I was like, wow, this is like a fantasy job. Like, they paid even if you had a prescription, you could expense it and they would pay your out of pocket for prescriptions that the insurance didn't cover. It was bananas. I was like, wow, this place is amazing. But then one time I took this phone call from our Germany partner, and my boss, who I didn't know was my boss, she was 22 years old, had just graduated from college, and it was her first job out of college. And they didn't tell me she was my boss. And she wasn't at my interview. She just was there. I thought she was the junior programmer because I was a senior programmer. And I said to the administrator, why does she keep asking me about the status of my projects? And the look on her face was hysterical. She was like, you don't know? I said, what? No, what? And she said, Jessica's your boss. And I said, what? Working there 5 months and I didn't know this woman was my boss. So in any event, so I take this phone call and she scolds me for taking this phone call. And so I went to our boss's boss and tried to explain what happened. And he said to me, Kristen, don't you ever challenge Jessica. She's your manager. And I was like, oh boy. I went and resigned. I went to HR and I resigned. I had nothing lined up. I had 2 little kids. I didn't care because I am not going to stay in purgatory because I don't deserve that. HR tried to talk me out of quitting. The director of global finance came in, tried to talk me out of quitting. I'm like, I'm out of here. I'm not
tolerating that.
Tolerating this behavior.
But, not many people have that. Like, first of all, they don't realize that they're going to come out on top one way or another because
I got a job a week later for $20,000 more a year. I didn't know that was going to happen.
Of course not. But you made your needs. You met your needs. But I think in most situations, if you say to somebody, hey, that's really insulting. This is why I took that call. If you don't want me to take calls like this, you need to explain that to me in advance and why. And even if you had said that to her, it's possible she'd have it out for you and then you'd have to quit anyway. But the more likely scenario is that she'd say, oh, I didn't realize it came across that way. And
I think people respond better when you approach them with humility.
Exactly. And respect. If I had gone to this woman 2 years before and had said, hey, you need to stop talking behind my back. I find it really insulting. That would have it would have put me in a totally different position. So to this day, that's what I tell people. Just say something, because most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, you're not going to get fired. 99% of the time, they're just going to say, okay, and maybe they'll do it again, but they're just going to dismiss you anyway. So saying it, the worst thing that can happen is you get fired. It's unlikely, the best thing that can happen is that you feel like you stood up for yourself and you gain a little confidence. And yeah.
I think
Ooh.
most people come to work wanting to do a good job. Most people do. And some misunderstanding has happened. And it's often based on assumptions that has created a rift in a relationship. But people ignore it, to your point. They think, well, I'll just ignore it and it goes away. Well, how well does that work in marriage? I'll just ignore all the problems that we have in our marriage and we'll see how well our marriage goes. Relationships are relationships. It's not going to go well because problems that get ignored become bigger problems that become harder to solve.
Exactly. It just simmers until it boils over. I think we all know that. So the question is, what step are you going to take next?
Yeah. And you have to think about the outcome you want, because a lot of times I think people address things or approach things without really thinking about the outcome they want. And so the tools, the behaviors, the approaches they take don't lead to that outcome.
Yes, I love that you said that. When I do customer service workshops, I often will say, you need to think about how you want this to end. How do you want this conversation to end? Whether you are a customer or whether you're providing the customer service, how do you want this to end? What's the best case scenario? And when I tell people, when I call Verizon and I have to deal with something on the bill, I write down best case scenario, what I'm willing to compromise, and what's the deal breaker. And the deal breaker has to be something that I can follow through on. So if I'm in a contract, I have to be able to plan out finding a new provider and eventually, over the next 6 months, getting rid of Verizon. But so you have to be okay with the consequences of the deal breaker. But basically, I go into a conversation with an idea of how I want it to end, and it changes how I speak.
Yeah, it absolutely changes your approach. And even though it may seem impossible, I think a lot of people make assumptions about how something's going to go. So I was in Target one time, and this woman and I were both trying to go down the aisle in opposite directions, and I moved to the left and she moved to the same direction. And then, that back and forth,
like
and
you're
you keep
dancing
blocking each other, the dance. She immediately got this angry look on her face. She was about to blow her top. It was really frustrating her that I was getting in her way, but we were getting in each other's way.
Right.
And most people would probably be like, oh, what a bitch or something.
Right.
Sorry. But you know what I mean?
That's okay.
We sort of put things back out. But what I did was I smiled at her with a huge smile and raised my hand to give her a high five. And she started laughing, and we high-fived each other, went around each other, and we're continuing to laugh as we both exited the aisle. You can recover someone from going down a really frustrated, angry path by giving them a genuine smile and just releasing that tension in a more positive way. I don't think people really realize the power of a genuine smile.
And if people have a hard time with that, because whether they're on the spectrum or there's something else going on in their heads, just being able to acknowledge that person saying, sorry, I'm going to go left. Just use your words. Use your words.
Use your words.
I know. We're such moms.
Use your words and we don't even do it.
I know. It's so frustrating. Kristen, this has been such a treat. I can't even tell you how much I appreciate it. I mentioned before we started before I hit the record button that I was really looking forward to this, and absolutely it didn't disappoint. It was exactly what I anticipated and better. So thank you so much. So for our listeners, what is the best place to find you? Tell me a little bit about the book that you are recording. And tell me a little bit about your children's book, just really quickly, where people can find it, what it's about.
So you can reach me on LinkedIn, Kristen Sherry, in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, because there's a number of us on LinkedIn. You can reach me there or at myyoumap.com through my website. I have a bunch of books coming out, but the one I'm really excited about that I'm recording the audiobook is called Maximize 365. It's a year of actionable tips to transform your life. And I'm working with a really talented illustrator to create a coloring journal that you can journal in color, adult coloring book, because it's a year of tips. So you're going to want to journal your actions and reflections and stuff. So I'm excited about that. The children's books are basically my best-selling book, YouMap, is to help you uncover your strengths, values, skills, and interests. And I've done the same thing in 4 children's books. So You've Got Gifts is out now, and it has exercises in the back for parents and teachers to have conversations with kids about their strengths and reinforcing them. So those are the projects I'm working on these days. Everything I do is about maximizing people to help them reach their potential.
Awesome. Awesome. And for our listeners, I will have links to her website, to Kristen's website, and to her LinkedIn profile in case you want to connect with her. And by all means, follow what Kristen is doing, because there is so much need for this. I think more than ever, as we shift into more of a gig economy, people finding what they're really good at and maximizing that, and also understanding the complements that they need, complement with an E, the complements they need in their lives to really maximize their potential. So,
Yes.
for instance, if you are somebody who speaks in bullet points, you need people around you who speak in paragraphs.
Yes, I spend a lot of my time surrounding myself with people who fill in my gaps.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. The book of the same title is now available, and the audiobook version will be released in November 2020. If you're ready to uncover your stories and learn to uncover the stories of the people around you to create stronger connections and healthier communities, visit elkinsconsulting.com. And while you're visiting the website, you can learn more about the book and the work we do to improve communication among teams and through our one-to-one coaching. Thank you.